This episode of Professor Tom's Philosophy in 10, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a brilliant philosopher. Dr. King has achieved mythological status in the United States, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Instead of understanding and appreciating the full complexity of his life and thought, King, as a cultural icon, has been simplified, distorted, and defanged. Students in American kindergartens, middle schools, and high schools are presented with a largely de-religified, depoliticized, and certainly de-intellectualized abstraction. King is often known only through a handful of inspirational phrases taken from a few of his speeches, and thus exists as a mostly tamed defender of the system, rather than as someone who presented radical challenges to American culture and the American people. In short, in the popular imagination, King, the great rhetor in service to current power structures, has displaced King, the acutely insightful philosopher who challenged us to think differently about our relationships with each other and about what human freedom is. Interestingly, you don't have to read much of King's writings to realize just how far the mythologized King diverges from the actual man himself. Consider his most important discussion of racial segregation, the letter from Birmingham jail, published on April 12, 1963, in response to an open letter titled A Call for Unity, published 4 days earlier in the Birmingham News. The Call for Unity letter was written by a group of 8 white local clergymen. In it, they criticized outside agitators, condemned the protests that King had been leading, and called for negotiation and action through civil court cases instead. King's letter considers and rejects this course of action, of course. The conditions in which King was writing were not ideal. Not only was he in jail, he started writing the letter in the margins of a newspaper. It was the only paper he had access to, and then finished it on more scraps of paper that were given to him by a fellow prisoner. King then passed these bits and scraps on to his lawyers piecemeal. The lawyers then took the bits and scraps of paper back to the protesters' headquarters, where they were assembled puzzle-like into the letter's published form. In spite of these difficulties, however, the letter is a work of genius and one of the most important instances of real-world philosophy in the 20th century. In fact, a quick scan of the letter might cause the reader to think that King had access to a university-quality philosophical library while he was writing. Consider the range of sources he cites, actually quoting some from memory, in a document of only 7,000 words. In the letter, King cites the Bible, the Jewish mystic Martin Buber, the Protestant existentialist theologian Paul Tillich, the United States Supreme Court, Socrates, St. Thomas Aquinas, fellow ministers, Jesus, St. Paul, Martin Luther, Elijah Muhammad, John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, the Pilgrims, fellow freedom fighters, and probably some others that I've missed. It's quite a list. This is not an empty display of erudition, however. King had in mind a very specific argumentative strategy, a strategy reflected in the wide range of sources he used. Understanding his audience and understanding the context of the letter are key to understanding his strategy. So let me say a word or two about the intended audience and the context. By the mid-20th century, political and moral philosophies had proliferated. The United States had become highly diverse, possibly the most diverse society on earth at the time. This included diversity among moral views, not just views of what is morally good or bad, but also diversity among theories of right and wrong. A significant percentage of Americans, for example, thought of morality as part of their religious tradition. Think for a moment about how diverse the religious landscape was, and still is in the U.S., but a significant percentage of the population thought of morality, by contrast, in purely pragmatic or utilitarian terms, and not at all as connected to religion. So this great diversity, not just in beliefs about what is morally right or wrong, but in convictions about what makes an action or state of affairs morally right or wrong, set up the primary problem King faced. How could he make a forceful argument against segregation that would convince people who are coming at the problem from so many different and sometimes incompatible directions? King's solution was both brilliant and simple. He set out to assess the morality of racial segregation from all of these different and sometimes incompatible viewpoints. But before I present his actual argument here, let's consider first a very simplified analog of the basic argumentative schema that he used. Let's say there are only two different possible moral theories, two different theories about what makes an action or a state of affairs morally good or morally bad. For convenience, let's call them moral theory X and moral theory Y. Now, if some proposed course of action is morally wrong according to moral theory X, and it's also wrong according to moral theory Y, then ask yourself, does it really matter which of the two moral theories is correct? After all, both theory X and theory Y give you the same answer. And if X and Y are the only two possibilities, well, even though we might not agree on which of the two theories is correct, we can at least agree that they say the same thing about what things are specifically morally right or morally wrong. King's great insight is that we spend a lot of time arguing at the level of theory, and that this might not be all that productive. We spend a lot of time arguing about which moral theory is correct, but if our theories agree that some action A is morally wrong, then even when we don't agree about what makes action A morally wrong, we agree that it is morally wrong, and that's probably enough for politics and practical matters. Now, back in episode 12, I introduced the ideas of decision trees and nonlinear interactive narratives as ways of modeling philosophical arguments. Let's use these to model the simple argument schema that I just set out. Here's what a decision tree for our simplified King-style argument might look like. And you can see that it basically has only two branches to it, and the branches lead to the same conclusion. Now, back in episode 12, I also described four types of nonlinear interactive narrative structures, or NINs, classifiable in terms of the number of endpoints that the structure has. And these are, first, infinite nonlinear interactive narrative structures. These have no endpoints. Second, there are unified nonlinear interactive narrative structures. Unified NINs have only one endpoint, but they can contain gauntlets, two or more branches that take the reader down unique paths, but which always lead one way or another back to the single endpoint. Third, there are true branching nonlinear interactive narrative structures. These have two or more endpoints. And finally, fourth, there are mixed nonlinear interactive narrative structures, which, as the name suggests, contain a mixture of infinite and either unified or true branching narratives. So which of these four types is the King-style argument schema we just looked at? Well, it's an example of a unified narrative structure with a pair of branches. If we were to instantiate this as an interactive story using the fabulous Twine software, here's what it would look like. Now, Dr. King's purpose was to show that segregation is unjust, but because he knew that he was talking to a very diverse audience who held a range of different theories of justice and morality, his strategy was to show that segregation is unjust on all plausible theories of justice and morality rather than on just one. And he identified at least 7 distinct theories of justice in the letter and talked about them. Let me set them out here. King's first theory of justice holds that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. And we can call this the Thomistic theory of justice. King's second theory of justice says that any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. We can call this the uplifting theory of justice. King's third theory says, to use the words of Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. And we can call this the I-thou theory of justice. King's fourth theory draws on the philosophy of Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? We can call this the sin as separation theory of justice. King's fifth theory says that an unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. We can call this the equal treatment under the law theory of justice. King goes on and writes, "Let me give another explanation. An unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote." And we can call this theory the enfranchisement theory of justice. And finally, for the seventh theory, King points out that there are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. And we can call this the justice in application theory of justice. So those are the seven theories that Dr. King appealed to. And as I mentioned, the structure of Dr. King's argument against segregation, well, it's quite similar to the simplified, unified narrative example we were just exploring. But instead of just two branches, King's argument has seven, all of which end up with the same conclusion, that segregation is unjust. So the general logic of King's argument is basically the same as the logic of our simplified schema. It just has a few more parts. Here's the decision tree for King's argument. As an argumentative strategy, the unified, nonlinear narrative structure with branches is very, very powerful. Many philosophical questions are at the level of theory. Which theory is correct? Theory X? Theory Y? Perhaps some other theory Z? Dr. King's strategy eliminates the need to answer such questions. If we can show that we always get to the same endpoint, the same conclusion, regardless of the theory we adopt, then we need not worry about which theory is correct. Not all philosophical problems are like this, of course. Probably only a small number are, so this raises the question, with how many philosophical problems can we take this approach? I don't really know the answer to this question, although I can point to some philosophical problems that do seem to have this basic structure. The main part of Socrates' death argument in Plato's Apology seems to have this structure, for example, as does the Euthyphro dilemma, which is derived from a question Socrates asked in Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. A number of philosophical paradoxes also seem to have analogous structures. So what we're going to do is explore some of those in future videos.